Hello and welcome to Call of Discovery, the podcast where we invite you on a journey into the Crucible for a fortnightly celebration of all things Keyforge, its community, and of course, the excitement of Discovery. I am still somehow here, your generic Brit, Ed, and I am joined, as always, by the less generic and more fantastical Zach Armstrong. Zach, how you doing, mate?
In defense of USA's opinion of people with your accent, Ed, none of us find you generic. We all are weirdly fascinated with the way you talk, just like generally in anybody who talks like you, just so you're aware.
Absolutely. Well, I actually had tea with Prince Charles earlier because we all know each other here.
Oh, wow.
Of
Of course. And I would say
afternoon
if you weren't happily partnered, you would do well in the United States. Yeah.
Oh, you haven't even met me, Zach. And you're propositioning me like this? This is shocking.
Hey, I'm not propositioning you. I'm just saying.
That's exactly what they
I'm just saying
say.
that if you say my name is Ed Pocock and I have a Keyforge podcast, is just, yeah. Anyways, things happen.
Normally the surname puts people off.
I did include it just for that reason. Just for that reason.
Hang on, Zach. It's not just the two of us today. We actually have a guest with us.
We do.
What? That's crazy. We don't have guests. Since when was this an interview show? We are delighted to be joined once more. He has not run away yet by Carlo from the board game channel, All You Can Board. Carlo, how you doing? Nice to have you back.
Yeah, not too bad, guys. Thanks for having me. Glad to be back. How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good, actually. Today is a good day. Although it's a little bit too close to Monday morning for me. Anyway, let's talk about this deck because it is quite a deck, isn't it? So would you like to introduce this deck, Carlo? Tell us, what's the deck called? What houses are in it? Give us a bit of a flavor.
Sure. All right. So this deck is called Novadrab, the Braggart of Strategy. So it is the second deck I've ever opened when I first got into the game. It's got my three favorite houses from Call of the Archons, which are Logos and Mars, which are probably my two favorite houses in the game, as well as Dis. It's the only deck I've opened that has that combination of three houses. And it's certainly not one of my best decks, like nowhere near. In fact, I think early on, and not to say that SAS scores everything, but I know that in the first few editions of the SAS rankings, it had a terribly low rating. It's kind of gone up since then, I think, just because of some of the board control and artifact control and such. But overall, I think the SAS ranking of 62 is even a little generous. I think most people would find it pretty tough to win with. And yeah, I just find it's the most interesting deck I have. It's the toughest to play around, and it's just the one that gives me the toughest decisions over and over. And it doesn't matter how many times I play the deck, I feel like I'm still learning about it. I'm still faced with just excruciating decisions every single game, based on not only what I'm drawing, but also the deck I'm playing against. So there's only 11 creatures, and only one of them in Mars. So I have, out of those 12 Mars cards, there's literally only one creature. And then there's 4 in Dis and 6 in Logos. There are 17 actions, 6 artifacts, and 2 upgrades.
Wow. There's a single Dominator in Mars, and that's just fascinating to me. I've known decks like this existed in Call of the Archons, especially with the kind of creature-less or creature-low Mars houses are kind of especially famous, but this is fascinating.
Yeah, and a lot of the cards in Mars play off of having creatures, so it really makes it tough. Like, I know a lot of people, Mars was probably my favorite house right off the first set. I know a lot of people really did not like Mars because there were decks like this where the Mars feels like it's kind of broken in a bad way, or it feels like it's really tough to play around, and this is probably the toughest or least powerful Mars set that I have in any of my Mars decks, but there's just something that keeps bringing me back to this deck because of how challenging it is to win with. And there's so many just anti-synergies or cards that just don't work together.
Yeah, but I suppose if you really do know this deck inside and out, Carlo, you can truly become the Braggart of Strategy.
Absolutely. Well played, sir.
Wow.
Well played.
Wow. So, the context that you play this deck in, is this something where you're playing Keyforge with a friend and you say, "Hey, I'm going to play a deck. It's not great, but play whatever you want because I kind of want to throw myself against the rocks and see how well I can do." Is like what's the context in which you find yourself diving into this deck to really enjoy how complicated it is?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. At first it was, I think I literally lost the first like 10 or 12 games, maybe even 14 games or so that I played with this deck. Like it took so long to even get my first win. So part of it at the start was just like my stubbornness at wanting to like prove that it wasn't just awful. Like when is part of it was like when people online were talking about like, oh, I just got a terrible deck, I'll never play this again. And part of it was like me wanting to prove to myself and maybe a little bit to other people that like even the worst decks, even the toughest decks, like can be figured out. Especially because this one has so many like situational cards, and they're if you look at just certain cards on their own, there's some standout really powerful cards. It's just a matter of getting them to work properly. So yeah, nowadays it's sort of just when I'm looking for something to really challenge me, a deck that's kind of when I have the let's say the mental capacity to play kind of like a brain burning deck, this is automatically the one I go to. Or if I'm playing with someone who's new to Keyforge and I want to set myself somewhat of a handicap, like rather than implementing chains, I just usually play with this deck against someone new.
And if it's a deck that you enjoy playing anyway, then you can have a lot of fun whilst teaching someone else, and not feeling sort of frustrated that you're not playing a game you want to be playing.
Absolutely. I don't have to hold back at all, but I
Mm.
also, like you said, yeah, I'm still having a blast.
So, I mean, putting your finger on it, aside from the lack of creatures, what makes this deck not just a kind of average deck? What makes it complex? What gives it that sort of cutting edge that means you want to keep coming back? The addictivity of it.
So it has a couple of the most, in my opinion, some of the most interesting cards in the game, which we're gonna get to afterwards, I imagine. But like stuff like Strange Gizmo and Martians Make Bad Allies. These are some really interesting cards that can be so powerful. Like there's this kind of spectrum. Like some cards are just like kind of always good. Like something like Virtuous Works, for example. You play, you gain 3 amber. It's always pretty good, right? But there are cards in this deck that sometimes they're terrible for me, or they're just kind of average, or they don't do much, and other times they win me the game. And it's that kind of like wide spectrum of how bad or good or effective, how much can this card suddenly maybe like save me the game, is what makes it so interesting. And even when you look at the bonus amber, if you're looking at this on decks of Keyforge, it says it has 14 bonus amber, but there's a few of those cards where something like Keyhammer, for example, like half the time I'm gonna have to discard the card and not even play it, so I'm not even gonna get that bonus amber. So even the expected or bonus amber, it doesn't always seem worth it or achievable to me. And then you look at the speed of the deck on decks of Keyforge is among the lowest of any deck I have. Yeah, it's just, and even the effective power on the board with the low creatures is so low. Like there's just it feels like everything is working against me when I play this deck.
Yeah, I see what you mean with saying there's just so many situational cards here. Like you have the Battle Fleet, which lets you draw more cards for Mars cards you have. Then the Martians Make Bad Allies, which, like in theory, you could purge most of your creatures in one go, and just
Right.
play with like the artifacts and just play with the artifacts and action cards. Like it's just fascinating. Have you tried playing this in like adaptive or reversal, or is the educational pushing the rock up the hill, playing it just straight up against another deck, kind of how you experience it the most?
You know what? I played it in a sort of reversal type format. I mean, I played it against a couple of my friends who just wanted to try it out, and they just said they're like, I don't know how you play this deck. It's terrible. This doesn't seem fun at all. Like people don't seem to really like understand or appreciate the enjoyment of playing it or how to really win with it. And the other thing would be one time I played it on the Crucible, and it was after I had gotten pretty familiar with the deck and was actually starting to like win some games with it. And I think
Yeah.
I beat someone fairly handily with it, and they said something along the lines of like oh, cheap deck, or like basically they implied that I like stole it from someone else, like oh, you're just playing some other with some person's deck. And I'm like, I just suggest them like rematch, swap decks, and they were like, yeah, sure. And then like they did terribly, and to their credit, at the end of the game, they did say they're like, "Hey, fair enough. Like this deck is trash. I don't know how you did that." And
Right,
I just said
right.
it's practice. It's the only like. There's no way I
Oh,
was. I told them like I lost almost every single game for the first like 20 games I played. Like you have to practice with this deck to know it.
Until looking at this deck list, I didn't know that FromSoft made Keyforge decks, but this really does look like a Souls-like type Keyforge deck, and we all know with those kind of games that you throw your controller against the wall, you sort of go, why? You have an existential crisis, and then you hit that sweet spot where you actually get the win, before you go into your next stage of absolute chaos and misery, and the cycle repeats. But for you, have you been able to topple any titans with this deck? Are there any sweet spot moments like that have, aside from the one you've just recounted, that really were sort of punch the air moments?
Honestly, I can't think of any specific example. Like I've played against decks where, I play against them and I look online and I see like how much higher the SAS score is, or, I look it up and it might have some power level already attributed to it. Like it's won some games in a tournament, and that always feels really good to beat some of those good decks. But I can't say I honestly have like a particular story or memory about like taking down a sort of, Goliath type deck.
yeah. It sounds like this might be to. I know you're fond of a particular Michael Jordan quote about how to succeed. This might maybe feels like your Michael Jordan deck. Then,
Yes, absolutely. It's a good shout out right there, Zach.
yeah.
Absolutely. That's yeah. This basically epitomizes that quote.
The quote for those who didn't have it float to mind, and I discovered this through Carlo's. I think I'd heard it once before, but it hit most meaningfully hearing it from Carlo at the end of the Mulligan video on All You Can Board's YouTube channel. And the quote is, "I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my career." For context, for those who don't know, Michael Jordan, most famous USA basketball player of all time. "I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusted to take the game winning shot and missed. I've failed over and over and over again in my life, and that is why I succeed." So I'm seeing that philosophy, Carlo, in how you approach this deck, because you said this deck is complicated. If I have to oversimplify, I would say this deck is not good, but I'm going to play this deck because I like to figure it out. And there's going to be that really rewarding moment where you do start to beat decks that piloted by anybody else this deck would not beat, because you've learned it and you know how to navigate it. That's awesome. I love that.
Yeah, yeah. And there's a certain level of like it makes me play Keyforge in a like there's things it makes me do that I would never do with any other deck. Like
Hmm.
people
Hmm.
always say, like, I remember when I started off playing the game and I would read stuff online, people were always like, it never makes sense to hold on to cards. Just like, if you're not going to play it, discard it, get it later. You don't want to take up hand space. And I know there's some kind of a bit of disagreement with that nowadays, but um, there's often times where I like it doesn't feel like it makes sense, but I'm just going to hold this card and then it ends up actually paying off for me. Um, or sometimes where I'll pick the same house over and over and over, in this case Dis, because I've got two Dominator baubles and a Lash of Broken Dreams in play, and I've got my only, I don't have many creatures in the deck, but I have a few Logos ones out there, so I can get by on just taking Dis, using the Dominator baubles, using these other creatures in play, and using my Lash of Broken Dreams to keep forcing my opponent to have more expensive keys, even though I'm not drawing any new cards, and I'm not furthering my board, and there's so many decisions that feel counterintuitive, that just feel so wrong. But that's part of what makes me keep coming back to it, is because again it challenges the way I think about the game almost every time I play it.
No, that's amazing. You don't have any topple the Titan moments, but what is your most memorable play with this deck?
Most memorable play, ooh, would probably be, I had a game once where so I talked about Strange Gizmo before, and Martians make bad allies. So I had a game once where I think I was at I had one key forged and I was kind of getting close. I had enough amber that, I was getting kind of close to my second key. And I think my opponent kind of had me on the back foot. They had a really, really strong board. And I think I played Logos, put out the Strange Gizmo, So here's the thing: I talked about the double Dominator Bauble and Lash of Broken Dreams, and how like that's if I don't get those artifacts out, there's basically no way I'm gonna win with this deck. Like it's not strong enough without those 3 artifacts in Dis are so key because they're they allow me to do other stuff with the other houses when I'm to have those strong turns. And I had a game where I was on that had that first key, I was going for the second key, I got over the top with Logos, played my strange Gizmo, and I had archived cards throughout the game. Like I have the 2 Biomatrix backups in Mars, but because I only have the 1 creature in Mars, like it's rare, I'm not gonna. A lot of the time, those Biomatrix backups have to be played on my Logos or Disc creatures. So I had a bunch of those that had died off throughout the game. I kept just like building up my archive, and then I had a turn where I played that strange Gizmo. My opponent, I don't think like was able to stop it, so it came back to my turn. I forged the key, wiped the entire board of cards. They had like a massive board. They were just going to basically reap to win. And on my next turn, or that turn right after I had forged, I had it in my hand Battle Fleet with some other Mars cards, including Martians Make Bad Allies. So I played the Battle Fleet, drew up a bunch of cards, and picked up my archive, and then used like not only did I get the amber from Battle Fleet and a couple, I think like maybe Deep Probe or one of the Squawkers or whatever, but then
Yeah.
I also had drawn the archive of all those creatures that I had archived, and then the Martians Make Bad Allies gave me that huge amber spike. And it was one of those ones where like if you walked up to the table and this was being played at a tournament and you looked at my board and their board and what the state of the game was, like you would have never bet money on me winning, right? Like
Yeah.
there's no conceivable way that that would have happened. But just like the combination of wiping their board and then having the exact non-Mars creatures archived that I needed to trigger that massive amber spike with the Martians Make Bad Allies just kind of swung the game.
Wow. Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah,
That's
and I wish
awesome.
it had been face to face, because when you play a game like that on the Crucible and you're just kind of like alone in your basement, you're like, yeah, and you kind of look around and you're like, whew, I wish someone was here to see that.
Oh, certainly, certainly. I guess that's what screenshots are for. But yeah, certainly not the same as if that happens across from a real live person.
Yeah.
That's true. That's true. So, my goodness, we usually ask. We have these lists of questions we ask for these decks for deck discovery episodes, and so many of them. I'm like, this doesn't really apply because of the way Carlo plays this deck. um, but 'cause one of my favorite questions we go to, and I think it applies to this deck quite well, is kind of what card gives you the hardest choice in a deck. So, is there a particular card that the decision space around the card is always kind of a bit of a head scratcher every time it comes up?
It's hard to pinpoint one.
It might be all of them. You can pick all 36 simultaneously, to be honest.
No, you know what? Here, I'll try and narrow it down to maybe 2 or 3 here. One that I haven't talked about yet that is a really tough one is EMP Blast. So
Mm,
that is gain an amber, and then the playability is each Mars creature and each robot creature is stunned. Each artifact is destroyed. So I only have 1 Mars creature again, so Exilix Dominator, and I only have 1 robot creature, I believe, which is Bat Drone. So at most I might stun 2 of my own creatures, but usually it's going to be 0 or 1. But the each artifact is destroyed part is what really challenges me, because it depends which artifacts, like it depends how artifact heavy my opponent's deck is and what those artifacts are doing to me, but also how powerful are my own artifacts, and then also at what, like how much of my deck have I gone through? Can I afford to, like if it's early in the game but I manage to get out those Dominator Baubles, Lash of Broken Dreams, even Anomaly Exploiter can be really useful at times. If I have those out early and I destroy them with this EMP blast, it's going to take a while for me to go through my deck and have them get shuffled back in again. Whereas if it's late in the game and my deck is almost empty, I've only got a couple cards left in the draw pile, maybe I can afford to do it, because if they get shuffled back in, maybe I can get them back out, but I have to weigh that against, like, am I playing that because it's so important that I get rid of my opponent's artifacts, or do I need that extra 1 amber from the card to put my opponent in check? Um, or sometimes it helps me get rid of my own strange gizmo when, in the odd case, let's say I got my Gateway to Dis out and I managed to wipe the board of creatures, and I always have fewer creatures than my opponent, so the Gateway to Dis is almost always going to benefit me. So if I played the Gateway to Dis and they don't have artifacts out, but I played the Strange Gizmo before just to get the Amber. Maybe I do want to play the EMP Blast to get rid of my Strange Gizmo before it wipes, some of my own. I guess if I would have played the Gateway to Disc previously, I might have had my creatures off the board before, but it's just like the timing of these cards is so crucial. And then I'm also going to highlight Martians Make Bad Allies again, because that's one where, depending which creatures I have in my hand, or do I really need these in play, or again, if I have those Dominator baubles out, do I really want to purge my own creatures? Like, then the Dominator baubles become less useful throughout the game. So it just feels like there's so many of these cards that just like I have to sit there puzzling out everything, like what's in my deck, what's in my opponent's deck, what's in my discard pile, what's the situation with the Amber, what are the odds that I'm going to get these artifacts back again, etc. Yeah, it's just, again, it just burns my brain every time I play with this deck.
And how does this deck fare against some of the later sets? So I imagine it maybe struggles a little bit more against board heavy decks, or am I completely barking up the wrong tree? That's a very British phrase, I think.
You know what? It's hard to say, because most of my, I would say a good probably 80% of my plays with it were in the first year or two that I was into the game. So a lot of my experience with this deck is against Call of the Archons and Age of Ascension, with some Worlds Collide as well. And I've played it a few times in the last maybe year or two against some of the newer sets. But I've noticed the SAS ranking has gone up over time, and I think that might be, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like maybe it's because like board wipes, like especially with, like, let's say Saurian, has like such a strong board presence, so like something like Gateway to Dis feels like it's now stronger than ever. In Call of the Archons, it was a lot of Amber racing and that sort of thing. Um, I feel like it's able to sort of maybe, I don't know, swing the game in my favor a little more against these newer decks, just because of something like not only Gateway to Dis, I mean, even stuff like, Mind Barb, getting them to discard cards, like slowing them down. It seems like it's harder for your opponents to, like, generally the decks have less like free or easy Amber gain. So I feel like nowadays, like, I look sometimes against the deck. Like recently, I've played a couple games on the Crucible and see my opponent's deck list, and I think, oh, those look like a lot of good cards, and I am expecting to lose or expecting to struggle. And as the game goes on, I start realizing that I was able to get rid of a lot of their cards that would generate a lot of Amber. Um, Even something like Deep Probe, which is like one of those cards where, you always have to look at, okay, what's their creature distribution, what have they already discarded, and or whatnot. And there's times where I end up using the Deep Probe, thinking, okay, they're close enough to getting their second or third key. Which creatures can give them the most power, like some of those ones like Fuzzy Gruin and whatnot. And even though that might be a long shot that they only have like, however many of those creatures in their hand, sometimes I'm playing that Deep Probe, and that's the difference of making them discard, a card that could gain them a lot of Amber. So from what I've seen, like, again, I was just getting destroyed all the time when playing this against Call of the Archons decks in the past, and I've gotten better over time with the deck, but it's hard to say if that's based on playing newer decks or just getting better with it.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. One more question for you, Carlo, before we head off. Keyhammer, love it or hate it?
Oh, much closer to hate than love. There's been the odd there's been the odd game here where it helps me out, because when I was saying before that I have those sometimes sequences in a game where I feel like I have to go dis over and over, sometimes what lets me break that cycle and let my opponent, like, let's say I go dis a few turns in a row and I stall and stall and stall, but I've got like a bunch of Logos or Mars cards in my hand, and I can't get anything else out on the board. Sometimes Keyhammer is what lets me then, you know, um, let my opponent forge, so that I can then play Keyhammer. Like, I'll take one turn off of dis, let them forge, and then I'll play the Keyhammer and the Lash of Broken Dreams. So every once in a while, the Dominator baubles on board are letting me use my like Brain Eater to attack, or my Quicks of the Adventurer, or whatever, to like draw a card, and I might even draw up the Keyhammer, and then that lets me take a turn to like add more of my, or dump my hand out of more Logos or Mars cards to then go back to dis. So it's the card that I like usually hate, but every once in a while I feel bad for hating it, because it can sometimes save me. But honestly, I would say Martian Hounds is probably the worst card in the deck.
What?
Because,
Really?
I have so few creatures, and it just I find it rarely does anything for me. almost every game
Ah.
I can think of the last maybe 10 times I've played with this deck, I don't think Martian Hounds has ever done anything for me.
I mean, House Mars as a whole doesn't really do anything
Oh,
for me.
wow,
So
them's
I
fighting
All
feel
right.
words,
you,
Zed.
man.
Okay. All right.
Easy now.
Okay. We talked about this. We talked about this.
I've stayed stoic for the whole episode. I just couldn't help it. I just couldn't help it right at the end there.
This is a deck I could talk about all day, every day. But in terms of what's most most interesting about it or most worth discussing, I think we pretty much covered it. It's yeah, this is the type of deck that brings me back to Keyforge. This is the type of, people talk about sometimes the value of the deck from like a financial perspective. Um, and this is the type of deck that brings me back to like the value. This is something that when I first played it, I thought, oh, this is a deck that I might just get rid of one day because it's not very good. And now, like, if I could only keep, let's say, 3 or 4 decks of the, 30 or 40 or so that I've opened, like, this is absolutely one that I would keep because the value to me and like the enjoyment it has brought me and the amount of time I've invested in the game and the way it's kind of like expanded my mind and the way I think about the game. There's no other deck I have that sort of has done that for me. So it's just interesting the kind of like journey it has helped bring me on as a Keyforge player as well.
Oh,
That
that's
is really
awesome.
cool.
That's
Really
awesome.
cool. Every deck has a story, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Apart
Yes.
from the unloved decks that sit in everyone's cupboard. You know the ones I'm talking about, listener. You know the ones. Sort it out.
But that deck could be their very own Novadrab, the Braggart of Strategy, if they just give it a chance.
But you'll never know if you
It's
don't give it a
true.
chance.
It's true. Oh, well, Carlo, thank you so much for coming back to talk about Novadrab, the Braggart of Strategy. We had a great time diving into this deck, and I've got to compliment you. You brought an extremely interesting deck that you have a ton of great experience with, and I think it was one of, for me, it was one of the more intriguing conversations we've had around decks people have brought. So thank you so much.
Oh, thanks for saying that. I'm glad you guys enjoyed it.
And of course, if they didn't catch it last time, Carlo, where can people find you?
Best place would be go to YouTube and punch in All You Can Board. It's a YouTube channel that I run with my cousin Dylan, mostly focusing on board games, but we do cover a decent amount of Keyforge as well as Marvel Champions, the card game.
Fantastic. If you play any other games besides Keyforge, I think you're going to have plenty of things to enjoy over at All You Can Board, certainly. And dear listener, if you're enjoying Call of Discovery, please make sure you're subscribed on your podcast app of choice. That way you can hear us as soon as we hit the podcast sphere. And if you're new to Keyforge, make sure you visit that new player guide at Archon Arcana, the Keyforge wiki, which we have linked below, where you can get started on your own unique journey into this wonderful game. Maybe you'll even find your own Novadrab. If you're looking to support us monetarily, you can visit our Patreon linked below, where you can sign up to support us and enjoy rewards like our exclusive Discord, where we get a lot of topics and questions for the show, as well as access to our exclusive Patreon-only behind-the-scenes podcast, Beyond Discovery. Let us know what you'd like to see more or less of in future shows by interacting with us across all of social media on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, or send us an email at podcast@callofdiscovery.com. But most importantly, if you think a friend would enjoy this podcast, please help them to discover it. Have you answered the call of discovery?